Jeffrey Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. A child whose quiet demeanor would one day conceal one of the darkest and most studied criminal minds in modern history. To understand Dahmer, one must begin long before the crimes, in a home where emotional disconnection was the language of everyday life. His father, Lionel Dahmer, was an analytical man, a research chemist whose rational mind approached life like a series of experiments. His mother, Joyce, was intelligent but deeply unstable, suffering from anxiety and depression that required medication and frequent hospitalizations. Theirs was not a violent home, but it was one marked by constant tension. Loud arguments, emotional withdrawal, and long silences that taught Jeffrey the earliest lesson of his life: that emotions were dangerous, unpredictable things best avoided altogether. As a child, Jeffrey was withdrawn but observant. Teachers described him as quiet and polite, but detached, as though he were watching the world through glass. At school, he was average, not unintelligent, but unmotivated. He rarely participated, seemed distracted, and often appeared lost in thought. Those who knew him in childhood said he had few friends. His isolation was not imposed from outside. He seemed to prefer it. His father's work with chemicals and his mother's illnesses made home life unpredictable. Jeffrey often spent long hours alone. It was during this solitude that he developed a fascination with the anatomy of animals. At first, it seemed like a childish curiosity, collecting roadkill, examining the bones, and preserving them in jars. Lionel, noticing this, assumed it was an early sign of scientific curiosity and encouraged him. But what Lionel saw as curiosity, others later recognized as obsession. Dahmer was not studying life. He was studying death. He would dismember small animals, dissolve them in acid, and keep the bones clean and white. To him, bones represented permanence, something that could not leave him. This fixation on permanence would become the central theme of his later life. He wasn't drawn to cruelty for its own sake. He was drawn to stillness, control, and preservation. By his teenage years, the cracks in Dahmer's psyche had widened. His parents' marriage deteriorated rapidly. Joyce's instability deepened. And Lionel's long hours away from home left Jeffrey in a world of chaos and emotional neglect. He began drinking heavily, sometimes even during class, hiding beer and liquor in a thermos he carried to school. His teachers noticed but saw him as harmless, a class clown with a dark, dry sense of humor. They didn't see the isolation and internal turmoil that had already begun to define him. When Dahmer was 17, his life reached a critical breaking point. His parents separated after years of conflict. Lionel moved out. Joyce, in a fit of desperation, took Jeffrey's younger brother David and left town, leaving Jeffrey completely alone in the family home for weeks. The isolation was absolute. It was during this period in June 1978 that Jeffrey Dahmer killed for the first time. He picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks, a young man traveling to a rock concert. Dahmer invited him back to the house for a few beers. They spent hours drinking, talking, and listening to music. When Hicks said he needed to leave, Dahmer panicked. The thought of being left alone again, the echo of abandonment repeating, triggered something uncontrollable. He struck Hicks with a dumbbell. The act was not born of rage but desperation. He later told investigators that he simply didn't want him to go. After the killing, Dahmer spent hours with the body. He didn't know what to do, but he also didn't want to let go. When decomposition began, he dismembered the remains, dissolving them in acid and scattering the fragments. This process, ritualistic, methodical, and private, would define the structure of his later crimes. Psychologists have often pointed to this event as the key to understanding Dahmer. The act wasn't about sadism or anger. It was about control, freezing a moment of connection before it could vanish. For the rest of his life, Dahmer would repeat this same emotional cycle, seeking intimacy, fearing rejection, and destroying the object of his desire in a desperate attempt to preserve it. After high school, Dahmer tried to move forward. He enrolled at Ohio State University, but dropped out within months, consumed by alcohol. He drifted without purpose until 1979, when he enlisted in the U.S. Army. The structure initially helped. He trained as a medic and served in West Germany, but his drinking soon resumed. Fellow soldiers later described him as quiet but strange, sometimes overly friendly, sometimes distant, with a tendency to stare through people rather than at them. After repeated disciplinary issues, Dahmer was discharged in 1981. When he returned home, his father, desperate to reform him, arranged for Jeffrey to live with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin. For a time, it worked. Jeffrey attended church with her, mowed the lawn, and appeared to find stability. But loneliness was always there, an unspoken companion. It was in his grandmother's basement that his fantasies began to surface again. He started bringing men home, at first for companionship. Then he began to drug them, wanting them unconscious, compliant, motionless. When they woke and left, he was consumed by guilt and anger. By the mid-1980s, Dahmer had been arrested for indecent exposure and petty theft, small acts that hinted at deeper compulsions. His social world was confined to the gay bars of Milwaukee, where he was known as quiet, polite, and strange. He preferred men who were vulnerable, those who could be persuaded easily, whose disappearances might not cause immediate alarm. His victims reflected society's blind spots: men of color, immigrants, the poor, the transient. In 1987, Dahmer's urges erupted again. Living in a small apartment downtown, he met a man named Stephen Tuomi at a bar. They checked into a hotel together, and Dahmer later claimed to have woken beside a corpse with no memory of the act. Whether or not that was true, his behavior afterward was deliberate. He transported the body to his grandmother's house, dissected it, and disposed of the remains. The murder rekindled the rituals he had buried since 1978. And this time, there was no going back. Over the next several years, the pattern intensified. Dahmer lured men home with offers of money, drinks, or photographs. He drugged them, and once they were unconscious, he enacted his fantasies of control. His apartment became a private world where time and morality had no meaning. He took Polaroid photos at each stage, before, during, after, creating a library of control and possession. The images, later found by police, formed a chilling timeline of his descent. To the outside world, Dahmer appeared mundane. He held a steady job at the Ambrosia chocolate factory. He was quiet, punctual, even polite. His neighbors found him strange but unthreatening. When they complained about the smell from his apartment, he explained it away. Spoiled meat, tropical fish, plumbing issues. His composure disarmed suspicion. In 1988, one of Dahmer's crimes briefly came to light when he was arrested for molesting a 13-year-old boy. He was sentenced to a year of work release, allowed to work by day, and returned to custody at night. Despite the seriousness of the crime, the court viewed him as redeemable. Reports about his drinking and psychological instability were noted but not pursued. Dahmer served his time quietly and was released early for good behavior. He moved into a new apartment on North 25th Street, where his crimes escalated beyond anything he had done before. The late 1980s and early 1990s marked the most prolific and disturbing phase of his life. He developed rituals that blurred the line between fantasy and forensic control. He experimented with ways to preserve bodies, attempting to hold on to what he had destroyed. He would later tell investigators, "I wanted to keep them. If I couldn't make them stay while they were alive, I thought maybe I could keep them after." It was not a statement of cruelty, but of delusion. A reflection of a man who saw possession as the only antidote to abandonment. Neighbors occasionally heard the sounds: power tools, the hum of a refrigerator running constantly, the clink of glass jars. When they complained, Dahmer's easy politeness neutralized their unease. He lived surrounded by evidence of his crimes: bones, photographs, and mementos. His apartment was not merely a hiding place. It was an extension of his mind, ordered and meticulous on the surface, chaotic and horrific beneath. Psychological analysis of Dahmer paints a picture of profound detachment. He displayed schizoid personality traits, emotional coldness, lack of empathy, and difficulty forming genuine connections. He drank constantly to suppress his guilt and anxiety. His fantasies grew into obsessions, and those obsessions into rituals. Every crime followed the same internal logic: seek companionship, lose control, reassert it through possession, and then erase the evidence. By 1990, he had developed a grim efficiency. He knew which drugs to use, which bars to visit, which lies to tell. The killings came closer together, one every few weeks. He photographed his victims, arranged their remains, and kept small pieces of them as mementos. He saw these acts not as cruelty, but as creation, a grotesque attempt to construct a world that would never leave him. The loneliness that drove Dahmer was paradoxical. He craved companionship, yet every act ensured deeper isolation. Each killing reinforced his alienation from humanity. He later said, "It was never about hate. I just wanted to feel close to someone, permanently." That yearning for permanence, expressed through acts of control and destruction, defined his pathology. The social conditions of Milwaukee in the 1980s made it easier for him to operate. The gay community faced stigma, and many of his victims were young men of color whose disappearances were not prioritized. Police bias, limited resources, and social prejudice created blind spots that Dahmer exploited. Several times, witnesses reported suspicious behavior. Each time, police accepted his explanations. In one notorious incident, officers encountered a young boy fleeing from Dahmer's apartment, injured, drugged, barely conscious. Dahmer convinced them it was a domestic dispute, and the boy was returned to him. He was killed within hours. This moment stands as one of the most haunting failures of the case, a literal handoff of a victim back to his killer. It revealed not only Dahmer's manipulative composure, but also the systemic negligence that allowed him to continue. By 1991, Dahmer's life had become an unbroken cycle of work, alcohol, and killing. His mental state deteriorated. His apartment grew more chaotic, his behavior more erratic. Yet outwardly, He maintained his quiet facade. Co-workers described him as polite, sometimes withdrawn, occasionally smelling of alcohol but never aggressive. He was a ghost moving through daily life, unnoticed, unseen, unstoppable. Inside apartment 213, however, the rituals consumed every waking hour. He no longer separated fantasy from reality. His journals, later recovered, revealed meticulous records of his victims, times and methods. A catalogue of control. He spent hours photographing his work, arranging remains, replaying the illusion of companionship. It was no longer about pleasure or even compulsion. It had become habit, the only structure in a disintegrating world. In the spring of 1991, the first real cracks appeared. A few men managed to escape encounters with Dahmer, and later described him as soft-spoken, oddly calm, and completely detached. They said it was as though he were performing kindness while suppressing something mechanical underneath. Forensic psychologists later concluded that Dahmer's demeanor reflected what's known as affective blunting, an inability to express or feel normal emotions. This detachment, combined with addiction and sexual compulsion, created a perfect storm of pathology. He was both aware of what he was doing and unable to stop. It was like a cycle that kept repeating itself, he said in one of his final interviews. I knew it was wrong. I tried to stop, but I couldn't. By July 1991, Dahmer's double life was unraveling. Complaints from neighbors were mounting. Missing persons reports were increasing. And inside apartment 213, his rituals were at their most extreme. He lived in a space filled with reminders of his control and his decay. The walls, the smells, the photographs, all were evidence of the mind that had completely collapsed inward. And yet, he remained unnoticed. One man in a city of 500,000, invisible behind a calm smile. His facade of normalcy had held for 13 years, but it was about to collapse. It was the night of July 22nd, 1999. Inside apartment 213 on North 25th Street in Milwaukee, a man named Tracy Edwards sat on the edge of the couch, handcuffed and terrified. Across from him, Dahmer paced calmly, murmuring about trust, control, and fear. The apartment was dimly lit, the air thick with the sour smell of chemicals. On the television, a film played quietly. The Exorcist 3, a movie Dahmer said he found fascinating. Edwards waited for a moment of distraction, and then struck. He bolted through the door and ran into the street, screaming for help. Two police officers, Robert Rauth and Rolf Mueller, stopped him. Edwards told them about the man in the apartment. The knife, the photographs, the strange smell. They followed him back to the building. When the officers entered apartment 213, Dahmer was composed, cooperative even. He handed them the key to the handcuffs without resistance. But when one officer opened a drawer in the bedside table, the facade fell away. Inside were dozens of Polaroid photographs, images documenting dismemberment and arrangement in grotesque detail. Officer Muller looked at Dahmer and said, "These are real." Dahmer simply nodded and said, "For what I did, I should be dead." What the police found over the next several hours would horrify the world. They opened the refrigerator and found severed heads wrapped in plastic. In the freezer, bags containing organs and bones. In a 57-gallon drum filled with chemicals, decomposing remains. It was the physical manifestation of the psychological landscape Dahmer had built for over a decade. Detectives quickly realized this was no ordinary crime scene. It was a personal museum of control, ritual, and isolation. The walls were lined with photographs, the tools of his rituals neatly organized. The investigators who entered described a chilling contradiction. The apartment was clean, even orderly. Everything had its place. The horror was hidden behind precision. News spread rapidly. By morning, North 25th Street was swarming with police, reporters, and curious onlookers. Neighbors who had lived beside Dahmer for years stood in shock. They had complained about smells, about strange noises, but none could fathom the scale of what was hidden in plain sight. As the investigation unfolded, the full scope of Dahmer's crimes became clear. He confessed to killing 17 young men and boys between 1978 and 1991. The victims varied in background but shared one tragic trait. They trusted him. Many were lured with promises of money, companionship, or photographs. Others were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Dahmer's confessions were methodical and emotionless. Over weeks of interrogation, he recounted every detail, each murder, each attempt at preservation, each ritual. The detectives, seasoned veterans, described his calm as inhuman. He spoke not like a man burdened by guilt, but like an observer recounting an experiment. The question that haunted investigators was why? What made him do it? Dahmer himself struggled to explain. He said he killed not out of hatred or rage, but to prevent abandonment. "I had to keep them with me," he said. "I didn't want them to leave." His words revealed a twisted logic. That possession was the only form of intimacy he could understand. As psychologists later analyzed his behavior, they identified a convergence of disorders: antisocial personality traits, necrophilic tendencies, and paraphilic fixations. But none of these diagnoses alone explained his peculiar calm, his control, or his meticulous record-keeping. Dahmer seemed to embody a void, a person for whom emotion existed only as theory. In custody, he cooperated fully. He waived his right to counsel, answered every question, and even drew diagrams for detectives, showing where and how he had hidden evidence. To investigators, it felt as though Dahmer wanted to purge his secrets, to finally have someone witness the world he had created in silence. Forensic teams catalogued everything from the apartment. Over 80 Polaroid photographs, human remains from multiple victims, and detailed evidence of long-term planning. They found cooking utensils, chemicals, saws, and even drawings of what appeared to be an altar, an arrangement of skulls and candles that Dahmer said he intended to build as a shrine to honor his victims. The media exploded with coverage. Newspapers labeled him the Milwaukee Cannibal. Television stations looped footage of police removing boxes from the apartment. For many Americans, it was the first time they had seen such horror associated not with a monster or madman, but with an ordinary, quiet man who looked like anyone else. His father, Lionel, was devastated. In interviews, he described struggling to comprehend how his son, the quiet, withdrawn boy who once dissected roadkill in the backyard, could become a serial murderer. He searched for answers in his own parenting, in genetics, in psychology. Lionel would later write a book, attempting to understand the unfathomable, to piece together the anatomy of evil from the perspective of a father who loved his son but could no longer recognize him. When the case reached the courts, the public reaction was polarized. Some demanded execution. Others, disturbed by Dahmer's apparent mental illness, called for psychiatric confinement. The central legal question became whether he was sane, whether he understood the wrongness of his actions. Dahmer's defense team argued that his obsessions and delusions had overwhelmed his capacity for reason. The prosecution countered that his elaborate concealment and methodical planning proved the opposite. The trial began in January 1992 in Milwaukee County Circuit Court. Security was intense. Families of the victims filled the courtroom, some clutching photographs, others staring silently at the man who had taken their loved ones. Dahmer sat expressionless, dressed neatly, listening as his crimes were read aloud one by one. Over weeks of testimony, forensic experts described his apartment, the photographs, and the remains. Psychiatrists debated his diagnosis, dissecting his mind with clinical precision. The prosecution portrayed him as cold, calculating, fully aware. The defense described him as a man consumed by uncontrollable compulsions, living in a world detached from moral reality. Through it all, Dahmer remained calm. When given the chance to speak, he was direct, even remorseful. "I know society will never be able to forgive me," he said. "I know I will be in prison for the rest of my life. I just wish I could give back what I took." His tone was soft, his words unsettling in their simplicity. After 2 weeks of deliberation, the jury found him legally sane and guilty on all 15 counts of murder brought to trial. The judge sentenced him to 15 consecutive life terms, nearly 1,000 years in prison. As the verdict was read, some family members wept, others shouted curses. Dahmer simply nodded, as though relieved that the performance was over. He was transferred to the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. There, life took on a strange new rhythm. Dahmer worked quietly in the prison library and later in the kitchen. He requested a Bible and began attending chapel services. Fellow inmates described him as polite but withdrawn. Yet even in prison, the notoriety of his crimes followed him everywhere. Some inmates saw him as a curiosity, others as an abomination. He was occasionally harassed, sometimes attacked. Prison staff kept him under observation for months, fearing suicide. But Dahmer seemed resigned. "This is where I belong," he told a prison psychologist. "I've made my peace with it." Over time, he expressed interest in religion. He was baptized in prison in 1994 by a local minister. To some, it seemed genuine. To others, a final manipulation. Psychologists debated whether his faith reflected repentance or a need for structure. His father visited regularly, maintaining a quiet relationship built on grief and confusion. Liconnell struggled to reconcile the gentle son he remembered with the man the world condemned. Their conversations, according to letters later released, were filled with theology, guilt, and attempts to understand forgiveness. In the broader world, Dahmer became both symbol and spectacle. Documentaries, interviews, and books dissected every aspect of his life. Scholars studied his case in criminology programs. Journalists mined his story for headlines. Yet amid all the noise, the voices of victims' families remained the most haunting. Stories of young men who had dreams, families, and futures, all erased by one man's compulsion. In November 1994, just over 3 years after his arrest, Dahmer was assigned to a work detail in the prison gym, cleaning alongside 2 other inmates. One of them, Christopher Scarver, had grown increasingly hostile toward him. On the morning of November 28th, Scarver attacked Dahmer with a metal bar, killing him instantly. The irony was not lost on observers. The man who sought total control, met an end that was sudden, chaotic, and violent. News of his death divided the public once again. Some called it justice. Others saw it as another tragedy, a final act in a chain of violence that began decades earlier. Dahmer's funeral was private. His body was cremated. The remains were divided between his parents, who continued to live under the weight of his crimes. In the years since his death, Jeffrey Dahmer has remained an object of fascination. Films, television series, and podcasts revisit his story again and again, each searching for meaning in the madness. But the truth may be simpler and more unsettling. There may be no grand reason, no single moment that explains it all. Dahmer's life is a reminder of how human emptiness, unchecked and unacknowledged, can evolve into monstrosity. Psychologists studying his case continue to debate whether he was capable of empathy. Some argue that his late-in-life remorse showed glimmers of humanity. Others insist that his calm and cooperation were just another form of control, a way to script his legacy. What lingers most about Dahmer is the ordinariness. He was not the theatrical killer of legend, not the genius manipulator of fiction. He was quiet, polite, forgettable. That, perhaps, is what makes his story so terrifying. Evil, in this case, wore no mask. It lived quietly behind a locked door in an apartment indistinguishable from the hundreds around it. The tragedy of Jeffrey Dahmer's story is not only in what he did, but in how many opportunities there were to stop him. Missed warnings, ignored complaints, institutional biases, all contributed to the longevity of his crimes. In that sense, Dahmer's legacy extends beyond himself. It forces society to confront its blind spots, the ways in which prejudice and indifference can be as deadly as violence itself. Decades later, the photographs, the interviews, and the evidence remain locked away in archives, rarely shown. The apartment building on North 25th Street was demolished in 1992. The ground cleared to erase the physical reminder of what happened there. But memory is harder to demolish. The story persists, echoing through culture and conversation. A grim reflection of what can happen when isolation, neglect, and desire twist into something unrecognizable. In the end, Jeffrey Dahmer's life is a study in absence. The absence of empathy, the absence of connection, the absence of intervention. His crimes expose the fragile boundary between ordinary and monstrous, between loneliness and horror. And though his story has been told countless times, it continues to unsettle because it offers no comfort, no easy answers, only the haunting truth that sometimes the darkness we fear most doesn't hide in the shadows. It lives next door. If this story left you thinking, remember to like, subscribe, and join us next time as we explore more true stories from the shadows, told slowly, calmly, and truthfully.